lovingly made for present and future generations of the Dunsmore-Robison clan. Dedicated to the legacy given by those who have gone before and those still to come. With the collapse of the main principles of the original Blue Stem Ranch, these were sad times. As a result of these adversities, some of the families lost out and moved away, while a few remained to carry on the heritage Al Dunsmore left for them. In 1926, John Dunsmore and his family moved to Weiser, Idaho, where they had friends and relatives. Alvador made his home with his youngest daughter Alma and her husband, Snow Ferguson, who were renting a farm just south of the original Blue Stem. In addition to farming, they were in the sheep business, and part of Al's later years were spent in the mountain pastures caring for the flocks. He loved the mountains and open spaces of Idaho. Herb and Alice Dunsmore continued the operation of their 80-acre farm 1/2 mile south of Ori and Myra Robison's farm. Ori and Myra Robison had developed a rather substantial base on their 400-acre farm and were able to continue their operation, but no longer would have as many family members with whom to trade work. The remaining Dunsmore, Ferguson, and Robison families still worked together at harvest time and played together on outings and fishing trips. Cousins played together and were inseparable. Even though some of the Dunsmore clan had moved from Roberts, the close family ties remained, and family get-togethers were continued over long distances and into extended families. Grandma Letty lived between her two sons' families. Ed, Ori's older brother, and his wife, Ruth, had lived in Texas part of the time Ori and Myra were there, but had migrated to Orange Cove, California, where they owned and operated a successful orange grove. Every Christmas, the Idaho family would eagerly await a big box of oranges and grapefruit sent by Uncle Ed and Aunt Ruth. On the farm, every member of the family had a job to do. Feeding the chickens and gathering the eggs was a family chore that the smaller children could do. As the children grew larger, they were given heavier work, such as bringing in wood, milking cows, weeding the garden, and carrying water from the hand pump. Tragedy struck the Robison family in the summer of 1924, when Raleigh, then 4 years old, contracted polio. Polio vaccine was not known at the time, and polio was one of the most dreaded disease a child could have. The disease was sometimes fatal and usually left the patient paralyzed in some manner. Raleigh was very fortunate that it was just one leg. Raleigh's mother, Myra, and the rest of the family spent several hours every day massaging and exercising his leg and stretching the muscles to help him regain use of the leg. Gradually, he regained partial use of that leg, but the muscles always remained shriveled and weak. Raleigh seldom complained, even when at times it was very painful. The devotion of the family was a testimony to the love that the family shared for each other. Teasing, joking, and pranks were a way of life in the Robison family, and Raleigh became one of the best. In 1926, finances were good enough for the Robison family to buy a new Hudson car. This made it possible to take a trip throughout Idaho, Oregon, and California, visiting family and friends on the way. Ori and Myra loaded the family into the car, piled luggage and camping gear on top of the car and on the fenders, and began the 4,000-mile road trip that would last a month. They camped out each night and prepared their own meals as they traveled. As they wound their way into eastern Oregon and down the Columbia River Highway into the beautiful Willamette Valley, the rich green countryside with tall fir trees was a sharp contrast to the flat, barren plains of eastern Idaho. Unbeknown to the three little boys, a vision of that beautiful Willamette Valley in Oregon remained in the minds of Ori and Myra. It would be a wonderful place to live. May of 1927 was a milestone for the Robison family. Alvin and Marie, as well as Elizabeth Cable, Marie's best friend and Alvin's childhood sweetheart, all graduated from Roberts High School. Alvin had missed a year in his 7th grade due to illness. This worked out very well for Alvin, as it allowed him to be with Elizabeth all through his high school years. Alvin wanted to study agriculture at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. Marie and Alvin's sweetheart Elizabeth enrolled in the southern branch of the university in Pocatello, now Idaho State University. Alvin found being so far away from his sweetheart to be an unbearable situation, but did finish out his year at college. But the next year, Alvin and Elizabeth decided to replace higher education with more important plans. They were married in 1929, and Alvin worked in partnership with his father Ori on the Bluestem Ranch. As 1929 ushered in, the economy of the nation and the world began to stagnate because of overproduction. Hard times were coming. The winter of 1928 and 1929 was terribly cold, with one blizzard after another and temperatures of 30 degrees below zero. The roads were blocked by snowdrifts 4 feet deep for nearly a month. The only way to get the children to school was to abandon the regular enclosed school wagon and use an open wagon bobsled pulled by a team of horses. The unceasing cold had frozen the snow with such a hard crust that the horses and bobsled could go over the top of the drifts without breaking through. Even with straw on the sled floor, a canvas stretched over the open top, quilts, and a hot brick for their feet, the 1.5-hour ride to school was nearly unbearable for the children. By the time the school sled reached the school, the smaller children would be crying with cold hands and feet. Frostbite was common and very painful. The cold blizzards also forced thousands of jackrabbits out of the desert and into the fields in search of food. The rabbits, standing on their hind legs, would eat into the base of a stack of hay as high as they could reach. As they ate through the haystack, it would eventually topple over, and the elements would ruin the hay which had been stored for livestock feed or a cash crop. Myra's health was beginning to fail. Her condition was diagnosed as extremely high blood pressure. The cold winters, high altitude, and stress of hard physical work were becoming too much. By the spring of 1929, farm prices had fallen to a new low, causing great anxiety for Ori and Myra. Myra's health condition made it impossible for her to cook and wash bedding for the big harvest crew. Ori assessed his crop prospects and determined that crop prices were so low the bank would not lend him sufficient money to hire the help needed to harvest the crops. It was a serious situation. There were many bills to pay. To solve the labor problem, Ori mortgaged his land to purchase a new tractor and grain combine. Wilfred, age 12, drove the truck and hauled the grain to the grain elevator in Roberts. Raleigh, age 9, and Keith, age 6, with a team of horses and wagon, stayed in the field to receive any dumps of grain while Wilfred made the trip to town. This mechanization made it possible for Ori and Myra's family to operate the farm with only 1 or 2 hired men, instead of 3 or 4 regular hired men and 18 men during harvest. This was a lifesaver for the Robison family, as farm prices were so low there was not any money to hire labor. Marie graduated from the Southern Branch of the University of Idaho in May 1929 with a teaching certificate after 2 years of college. She was able to attain a teaching position in the Roberts Grade School at a salary of $110 a month. There were no fringe benefits. Jobs were very scarce, but she could live at home and ride to work on the school bus. Raleigh was in her 5th grade class, Wilfred in the 8th grade, and Keith starting the 1st grade. Wilfred and Raleigh were very good students, and because of their good record, Wilfred had been advanced 2 full grades and Raleigh 1 full grade. Marie contributed a good share of her small salary to help with the cash needs of her family. In October 1929, the United States stock market crashed. Many people lost their life savings. Some people in the cities, unable to cope with their losses, jumped out of the windows of tall buildings to their death on the street below. These losses thrust many people into a state of poverty. Factories and businesses were closed. Unemployment in the United States reached 25%. There were very few jobs available. In cities, large and small, long soup lines formed to feed the hungry and homeless. The Great Depression had begun. Prices were so low for wheat and alfalfa hay that the Bluestem Ranch couldn't generate enough cash to live and pay the banknotes. However, people on the farms were much better off than those in the cities because they could at least grow their own feed for their cows, pigs, and chickens, which provided meat and eggs that they could eat. The milk cows furnished milk, and the cream could be churned to make butter and cheese. The summer gardens all provided fresh vegetables, with some extra to can in glass bottles. When people don't have cash to buy what they need, then they have to turn to a system of bartering. They traded eggs and meat for salt and sugar at the grocery store, traded wheat for flour. Butter they churned was traded to the grocery store for spices, raisins, and fruit.
Daddy's mind hit upon a way to generate cash for the family. We could turn some of our shorthorn beef cows into milk cows and sell the milk and cream to the creamery for cash. Well, these were cows that had never been milked, and they wanted no part of it. The circus began. There was a lot of crashing and bucking and bellowing and some well-landed kicks that knocked the Robinson boys, including Daddy, across the barn. Some of the cows had to have their back legs tied together with ropes before milking. But by spring, the barn was finally filled with milk cows, and the cream check, though not large, was a welcome sight each month in the mail. Marie Robinson.
Every morning and evening, rain or shine, Sundays or holidays, found the 3 boys and their father milking the cows. Ori milked 4 cows, Wilfred was assigned 3 cows, Raleigh 2 cows, and Keith was given the oldest, most gentle cow to milk. Alvin and Elizabeth had their own cows to milk and care for at their home on the Pack Farm 1/2 mile north and 1/2 mile west of Raleigh and Myra's home. Spring of 1930 brought the joyful occasion of Richard Alvin's birth, Ori and Myra's first grandchild. Herbert and Alice, 1/2 mile south of the Robinsons on the opposite side of the road, milked a small herd of Guernsey cows which gave them a steady monthly check. This supplied them with the cash needed for their living expenses. They were existing, but not prospering. In July of 1930, the 3 Dunsmore children, Rena, Claire, and Ora Joy, were rushed down to the Robinson home for the day, and Dr. Jones arrived at their house to deliver 2 little twin boys, but sadly, both died at birth. Alice wrapped each one in a little blanket, gave each a kiss, and handed them to Herbert. Herbert took them out and laid them to rest in a pretty little spot in the garden. In 1930, the Depression deepened. Farm prices had plunged far below the price required to pay the cost of producing the crop. This made it impossible for them to make the payments on their land, and foreclosures became commonplace everywhere. Ori was not one to give up, but this time he felt the gnawing pain of defeat. On March 12, 1931, Ori and Myra's portion of the Bluestem Ranch was repossessed by the bank. So many farms in the area were in the process of foreclosure that the banks and mortgage companies were willing to accept most any proposal made by farmers willing to farm the properties. Beneficial Life proposed that Ori lease back the property he had deeded, which would be better than letting the land lie idle. Ori had the equipment and the know-how, so he agreed to lease the same land back on a crop share basis. Ori would give Beneficial Life 1/3 of the crop each year for the use of the land. The Depression had brought all of the people in the Roberts community down to a poverty level, and they were struggling for a meager existence on the farms where they lived. The hard times were a leveler that placed nearly everyone in the same social status and gave them one thing in common. Everyone was poor. Since everyone was on the same social level, the children didn't seem to know they were poor. There was little class distinction, and all the kids in the neighborhood played together. The Robisons' Big Red Barn was a favorite place to play and became a gathering place for all the kids in the community. In the summer, the favorite swimming hole was over by the Indian duck blind, where the canal was wider and deeper. The other favorite place to play was the Robisons' large barnyard, where they gathered to play hide and seek, run sheep run, dare base, pump pump pull away, Washington poke, kick the can, and any other game that could be invented. In the winter, ice skating on the canal, sleighing on the hard-packed snow in the roads while being pulled by a horse, hunting rabbits in the lava fields, playing fox and geese in the freshly fallen snow, and building forts in the snow for snowball fights were the favorite winter games. Or, if the weather was bad, it was back to the Robisons to play in the Big Red Barn. However, unbeknown to the children, the parents were not enjoying the bliss that the children were basking in. These were very hard times, and the parents were struggling to make ends meet. Anxiety and stress existed in every family, and tempers flared.
Disputes over irrigation water and water rights were common. At times, irrigation water was in very short supply, and getting water on the thirsty crops at the proper time was critical. It had a direct effect on what little income the farmer would have to feed his family. With so much at stake, serious fights broke out between neighbors. On one particular day in the summer of 1931, Daddy and neighbor Albert Harris got in an argument on the canal bank with shovels. After a few swings, and Albert getting knocked into the canal, they decided that this was pretty dangerous business fighting with shovels and called a truce. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt, and they went their separate ways. Marie Robison.
The summer of 1931 was a difficult time for everyone. A terrible drought had struck the Midwest plains of the United States, leaving the soil dry of the necessary spring moisture to grow crops. The windstorms whipped the loose, dry soil into huge drifts, covering crops, roads, fences, and even parts of houses and barns. Many farmers in the Midwest were forced to abandon their farms, leaving their plows and farm equipment covered with blowing soil and drifting sand. It was called the Dust Bowl. The drought had reached the Rocky Mountains as well, but it came as a lack of snowfall in the mountains, creating an early spring and shortage of irrigation water. The dry, open fields and early spring winds lifted the soil from the fields of the ancient Market Lake bottom and piled it into drifts along the fences of the old Bluestem Ranch. To compound the problems already suffered, the mild winter caused millions of grasshopper eggs to hatch out in the desert soil of the lava fields west of the Bluestem Ranch. Hordes of ravenous young grasshoppers marched eastward into the succulent, green irrigated wheat and alfalfa fields. By nightfall, these swarms could destroy an entire field of precious crop. The only known remedy was to spread poisonous bran in front of the advancing army of grasshoppers for them to eat. Ori rushed to town to purchase sacks of poisoned bran. Mobilizing the entire family, they hurried down to the fields to spread a row of poisoned bran in front of the advancing army. The leading grasshoppers stopped to eat the bran, creating a front line of dying insects. The advancing front soon piled high over the dying grasshoppers that covered the bran. Some stopped to cannibalize the dead, but others crossed the line and continued on towards the green fields. The Robison family tried to beat them back with gunny sacks, but that soon proved to be useless. Ori threw gasoline on the advancing line of grasshoppers and set it afire. Millions of insects kept advancing when the flames died down. In desperation, Ori filled the large canal around the west side of the fields with water. The grasshoppers stopped at the edge of the water. Some jumped in and were swept down the canal. Others took wing and flew over the canal into the lush fields and began to eat the crops. Finally, Ori tried one last, desperate move. He flooded the green fields with water from the canal. Those that weren't drowned were baked by the summer sun reflecting off the water. Ori knew that if he was to have his beloved Myra with him much longer, he must get her to a lower altitude very soon. The thought of the beautiful Willamette Valley in Oregon kept coming back into his mind. How could he accomplish this? In the back of his mind lingered the pain of losing the farm that he loved so much. The house, the barn, every fence post, every ditch, and every field that had been the product of his labor for the past 17 years. Maybe they should make a trip to Oregon to see what the prospects of moving there would be. But would the old Hudson make such a trip? Marie suggested that they trade in the old Hudson on a new car, and whatever was needed for a down payment, she would pay from her teacher's salary. In June of 1932, Ori, Myra, and Keith set out for a trip to Oregon in a new car reliable enough to make the 1,600-mile round trip. The beautiful Willamette Valley at sea level, mild winters, and rich soil would be an ideal place to start over. It would take 2 more years to find a way.